Part two. We'll be looking at the texturing and materials. Let's get started. So, while this is the final render that we want to do, I would start the process by having a reference map, or having a reference lighting system that is more of a daylight system. So in the project there's a daylight map, which is probably just a standard map that Unreal gives you. It seems to be the standard map that the Unreal gives you, and I would use this so that we can better look at the model and the details in a reference kind of lighting way, where it's very bright, so we can see the true colors. There's no it's not the sundown, it's not sunrise, it's not a night scene. It's a very natural, normal scene. We have some clouds, we have the sun there. So if we know that if it looks good here, then it'll definitely look good when we add a more interesting cinematic lighting scenario. So this is how I would have when doing any kind of texturing work, materials, a reference scene where you can put the model, see how it looks from every angle, and you can multiply, have the model multiplied a couple times, and it'll just make it a little bit faster to see different angles and how it reacts to the light, how it reacts to the environment, the reflections, and stuff like that. So this is how I would start the process, by setting up a reference scene with very neutral lighting conditions. A small word on the UV mapping. This won't be a tutorial on UV mapping, but before you texture your prop or your model, you obviously want to UV map it properly, and we can see how the UVs are laid out here, especially on the locations like the cylinder. It's made sure that it's straight and equal on the barrel, on the same thing. So if we would want to make a specific texture, any kind of change here, you would know that what you paint here is what you get. Obviously the handle, it doesn't really matter that much, because it's more organic, and the same thing with smaller details. It's not that important, especially on the metal, because at the end of the day the metal is just going to be a single color, and with the ambient occlusion, bit of roughness and scratches. So it's not super important. But on these cases, like the long flat surface, you want to make sure that it's actually laid straight on the UV canvas. So it'll make everything easier for the process. And specifically, if you want to add things, like you would want to add a normal map feature here or something, then it's very important. So if you look at the material setup, which you can on the right here, and it has a single material which pretty much looks like this. So there are a couple of textures and a couple of settings I want to go through. It's not a very complicated material or a complicated setup, but let's go through it. And we can just go one by one. So we have a standard AO map, which is just the ambient occlusion texture. And if you double click that, you can see what kind of texture it is, which is just a baked ambient occlusion texture from the web. Now if you use baked ambient occlusion textures, you want to make sure that if the model ever gets animated, that you have that it doesn't have any, that it supports the animation. So it depends on the texture use you want to use this for. So that you would make another which is more animation friendly here, which is a slightly different texture. Like here, there is a shadow on the revolver, on the cylinder, which is not there in the animation version, because in the animation you would obviously have the cylinder rotating, and if it has a dark spot, then yeah, it's not very good. And there's another texture, and it goes into a couple of different nodes. It goes into the it's used as a multiplier for the diffuse texture, and this just uses as a, it gives like a, it darkens the shadows on the diffuse, which would emulate kind of like dirt getting into spots where it's more crevices, and spots that are more not occluded are will have less dirt, and it just gives a nicer effect for the texture overall look. And yeah, this roughness map, which is just how rough the textures are, and you would use this mainly. There's no specularity here, it's a static number 0.5, and what you do is use the roughness map to get these kind of different specularity levels, where you can see that there's scratches and things like that. One of the more important maps actually here is the clear coat roughness. So this material here is set up. It's set up as a clear coat material, shading model here, clear coat. So what's the difference between the clear coat and the standard one, which is default lit? And it's basically the fact that a clear coat material is what's needed for this type of weapon, where you have a metal, but because it's a weapon, this metal would be oiled. So the user, I mean, if you have tools, you keep them oiled to protect the metal. So to get them to look oily, you can do this by just using a standard material, but it looks a lot better when using the proper material, which is the clear coat. So you get two specific material responses for it, the base metal response, and then the clear coat, which would be the oil. And it's one of the more important ones for this type of metal to make it look very nice. And then we have basically an ID map texture, which just interpolates between some of the diffuse maps, which I wanted to do a separate texture for the wood handle, which I then scale and turn around here on the texture coordinates side. So it's not that there is actually a place on the diffuse texture for the wooden handle, but I don't use it because I wanted something different for it. So so the way I handle it is by having a separate wood texture, which is then interpolated into the material and to the base color. So this is the texture. This is hand painted or handcrafted, so it's not a photograph, which you will kind of like see that it's not an actual real real wood, but when it's actually when you see it in use, it very much looks appropriate, and it's more picked for like aesthetic purposes. There's this gradation and shading which is positioned in a way that makes it look nicer. Really, that's the only qualification for it. And yeah, so the end result is very nice, and you wouldn't really know that it's not real wood texture. And yeah, it's a good way to get a very specific look, to have a very specific interesting grain pattern for your handle. And this is how, if you have let's say a nicer quality a pistol or something, you would be very specific on what type of block of wood you would use it for. So you would pick a nice interesting pattern for it, and that's what we did here. So yeah, it's a pretty simple texture, pretty simple material setup. You don't need a very complex thing going on here. You can look at the roughness map, and it's a pretty standard roughness map. You have things that would be kind of like all the edges, which would be smoother, or it depends a little bit on what you want. So in one case, things that are in the crevices, more occluded, they would be more dirt, and things that would be more open, in the open, like the edges, they would be smoother in some cases. But it really depends also on what the type of use would be. So you could have things that are in the open and not in the crevices that would experience more wear and tear, and they might end up becoming more rough. And then things that are in the crevices would actually be protected from wear and tear, and they would remain smooth. This depends really on the material, and like leather, metal, wood, all these different materials would work differently. So yeah, you gotta pick. You gotta think what is it you want. What kind of material response do you want? Do you want the crevices to be smoother or rougher? And this will give you a different kind of. There's no real right or wrong, but you will get a different kind of result from it. So yeah, that's about it for the material. A simple setup, and I believe it's all hand painted or generated textures like the ambient occlusion, and yeah, that's about it. So this is how I would do the wood texture for the handle, and you can either go and grab texture from online. You can take a picture yourself, or you can just build the textures from scratch. Now, I'd recommend building them from scratch as much as possible. It takes more time, obviously, but it's the only way that you will grow as an artist, by studying things, by studying surfaces, and then recreating those surfaces. So it's more of an illustrative process. And let's just go through for the wood texture. So in Photoshop specifically, this is a specific technique. You can paint it by hand. You can use any kind of technique, but this is a fast way to do it. So you can just apply a filter here, from render and fibers, because obviously wood is just fibers. So you get this kind of result. And yeah, I mean, it looks kind of like woodish already. So you can add things like knots by simply going and using the liquify modifier or the liquify tool and using the twirl tool. So you can start adding, basically that will end up looking like knots. And depending on, so depending on how what kind of size do you use for the tool and things like that, you can use a really large size to get, obviously too big, and then smaller ones. But yeah, you would just use this, go around, play with the settings, and eventually you will get something that you like. And then you would just use this as a mask to colorize. So you could just drop, you can just multiply this, erase this, add some kind of color as the base wood color. For the pistol, it was more of a maroon or more reddish, and then you can just use this as a multiplier to get different kind of tones. And obviously this is just a fast explanation on how to get something done. You would take more time to create the final texture, obviously, adding more details. Obviously this looks horrible, so you would search for a pattern and tweak around to find what you want. And you would also, the best way to get a nice result for the handle would be to remind yourself what's the size of the wood. So if you build this handle, the handle is about, let's say, 10 centimeters, 12 centimeters. So what kind of features are in a block of wood that's 12 centimeters? And that's why it's important to find references and study yourself, and then you'll be able to better approximate what you want. So you don't add, so the details you add won't be too large or won't be too small, but it actually looks like it's made from a real piece of wood. So yeah, that's about it for texturing. It's pretty simple nowadays for the texturing part. Previously you used to hand paint all these features, but nowadays, since most of it or a large part of it is the shader, and getting proper settings for the shader, getting proper colors and values for your model, is actually almost more important than texturing. The texturing is just adding very small amount of detail to the model. And some things like adding, like here we have a little bit of darkening here. It's more like how would I say, it's more of an artistic choice where you add things, you darken and brighten spots depending on basically what kind of story you want to create with the texture, and just to create more interest, and push things back and pull things forward. So it's more of a painterly job, but it's a very minor detail. Most of the texturing is just very small micro details that will support the more of like the touch feel of the material. So if you would basically run your hand on the model, how it would feel. So this would feel like cool and metallic and smooth, and then you would have a warmer handle, and But the actual textures are very simple nowadays. And yeah, especially for this kind of prop, which is very natural materials. There's nothing weird going on. Yeah, it's a pretty straightforward job. The biggest thing probably is for animation's sake, you would need to make sure that the ambient occlusion supports the animation. So yeah, that would be obviously depend wholly on the animation case, and is it for animation? Is the prop high of is the prop far away from the camera, or is it close up, stuff like that. But yeah, so that's about it for the texturing and shading. And on the next video we'll go through some of the lighting and rendering techniques, and to set up this final image. And yeah, thanks, and we'll see you next time.